I find it very interesting and pertinent that Africa, China, and India right now have the same population, basically, 1.4 billion people each. The biggest operating difference, aside from poverty and the ecological conditions and so forth, is that Africa is 55 independent countries. India and China are unified states, albeit in a kind of federal arrangement or semi-decentralized arrangement in both cases to some extent. So Africa's biggest issue, in my view, is unity, creating a free trade area on the continent, organizing its infrastructure on a continental scale, having continental-wide monetary and financial policy, and really trying to replicate scale so that the internal market of the African continent and other benefits of scale can be achieved. And this is a huge political issue. Obviously, countries don't easily don't easily cede sovereignty to a supranational entity, but Africa is so far behind, so much in need of development right now, so vulnerable internally and externally, that I think the case can be made, and I'm certainly trying to make it all the time to African leaders, that they better create an effective union right now. And this is a message that I give all the time. Having said that, if the union can really be created, one can actually foresee a rapid growth period for Africa, which would be unprecedented, basically. And the reason is poor countries have headroom for rapid growth. This is the most basic idea in economic growth, which is that if you're capital scarce, the returns to investment are very significant. If you don't have electricity, it's great to add electricity. If you don't have roads, it's great to add roads. If you don't have rail, you get a really big return to adding rail. If you don't have high school completion, boy, do you get a big kick from going to high school completion. So you can identify the investment strategy that's needed. And I've worked out in a recent study that I did with the African Development Bank a scenario for the next 40 years modeled on China's 40-year growth from 1980 to 2020, in which Africa becomes a high-income economy by 2063, which is their 100th anniversary of African unity. Now, just one added footnote to that. Africa was about 7% of the world population, if I remember correctly, in 1950. Today, it's about 18%. Africa is the only region of high fertility in the world right now. It's the last place with the demographic transition. It will have it, but it hasn't had it yet because it hasn't had the breakthrough to girls' education through high school and other things and urbanization and so on. So the transition will come, but in 20 years from now, perhaps. And this means that on a reasonable trajectory, I mean, plausible is what I mean. I don't mean good, but just plausible trajectory, Africa will have 2.5 billion people around mid-century, maybe 2055, 2060. And on the current UN medium forecast, which I don't think is accurate, but it's their medium forecast, Africa reaches 3.8 billion people by 2100 and constitutes 38% of the world population by 2100. Now, imagine if Africa grows rapidly in economic terms and has this population growth. Africa becomes actually a major part of the world economy not a fringe part of the world economy, even by mid-century or by 2060. So this is my view of what should happen. It is a major political action that is required more than anything. It is the unity to say we're going to do this in one coherent step, because frankly 55 countries are not going to make it on their own, and 14 of them are landlocked, and landlocked countries can't even function if they don't have ports. So to put it bluntly, if Africa gets its political act together, and again, it was Europe that created this messy map, but if Europe gets its political act together, it's going to be a big part of the world in the 21st century.
The man you just heard speaking is called Jeffrey Sachs, and I don't think I've heard a single time when he's been speaking publicly where what he says doesn't make a lot of sense. He's a professor at Columbia University in the United States, where he works on sustainable development. Basically, it's a sector of economics that looks at how we can eradicate poverty and develop economies so they can rise out of poverty into, a flourishing and viable, economically wealthy economy. He's been an advisor to the Secretary General at the UN. He's been an advisor to several countries around the world for this very topic. And more recently, I've seen him be a quite outspoken commentator online. He calls out American imperialism all of the time. So I think it's safe to say this isn't somebody just plucking ideas out of the sky. This is somebody who lives, studies, and understands how economies grow. And I want to unpack further some of the things that he highlighted in that video that we watched at the beginning. You see, Africa is in desperate need of a solution. It should right now be looking for a strategy for its people to become self-actualized, economically wealthy, and for the continent to be a thriving and rich place, according to what we all understand as the continent being a very mineral-rich place, and just the idea of living up to its full potential, which we know Africa currently doesn't do. There are many positive signs that we can get there, but highlighting this unified continent of Africa concept, I believe, just like Jeffrey Sachs, this is a key thing that we need to do as Africans in order to get to where we know we need to get to. So he starts off the video talking about a comparison between the continent of Africa, population-wise, with India and China. And actually, there's quite a few comparisons to be made. Africa has tried being 54 individual states. And the question I would ask is, how is that working out for us? Why don't we try a new path? We all seem to want unity. We all seem to understand that unity is something good. Well, let us now start thinking about how we can put that into action. And because of the comparisons we can make to China and India, there is some blueprint for us to follow. And we can see the results of what happened when a similar population size actually does this. The rest of the world sees Africa as one place. Anytime an African travels to Europe or America or whatever, Africa is the key identity that they will assign Black people. Why don't we embrace this? So of course, Sachs mentions that this will be difficult. It won't be easy. And of course it won't be easy. It'll be very difficult. There are many challenges, but there's nothing worth doing that doesn't present itself with challenges. And we as a continent are going to have to actually decide what we want. Do we want to stay economically at the bottom? Or do we want to actually figure out what works and what will get us to where we want to go to? Sacrifices will have to be made if we want to achieve what we want to achieve. I mean, that's just a principle of achieving anything worth having. So individuals need to decide that this is what we want, and we need to build the political will in order to move in this direction. Thankfully, we are seeing signs of this. And I think that's what Ibrahim Traore and the AES states represent. They've already started unifying in their little zone, a unity that is anti-colonialism, that wants the best for its people, that wants growth and without corruption and all of these things that have been so associated with the negative political systems that we see in Africa. And ultimately, we just have to decide that we are tired of failing. This should be the motivator, that gets us to put our differences aside and move forward in unity. Now, let's just try and talk about this more practically, because I understand the challenge that it will be to like make all of the African countries become one nation under, one umbrella. It's going to be very tough. But if you look at the European Union, they have found a way to become one trading bloc without giving up the individual sovereignty of each nation. If you have an EU membership, you can travel amongst and work in any EU state. So we can do things to act like a unified state that may not need all the bureaucracy and all of the kind of change associated with like making a country called Africa as opposed to the continent of Africa. So that looks like a high-speed rail system, continent-wide infrastructure, integrated visa system, free trade, where we look to incentivize trade amongst ourselves, playing a tariff game, playing whatever game we need to play, so that we are incentivized to work with ourselves, forge business and economic ties so that we're more bonded together. You've got this place over here that's known for iron ore, but maybe that place is landlocked. So you make the kind of economic ties with a place that has a port and maybe some refining capabilities. And all of a sudden, there is more cohesion between these two nations. This kind of thing should be looked at and studied. Like if we make an assessment of all the resources across the entire continent, and then we can see how we can integrate the use of these resources for the betterment of the continent first before everyone else, which at the moment it's been us last and the whole world comes and pillages from the continent of Africa. We're also upset about it. Well, this is how we start fixing it. Another key way to make Africa more unified is if we had a single currency. We are now seeing the rise of digital currencies. It's more easier than ever to set something like this up. We could decide if we wanted to do a resource-backed currency, a gold-backed currency, a digital currency, a crypto blockchain currency. We could figure this out if we really wanted. We've already seen the example of the euro. In my lifetime, when I was first born, there was no euro. All of the European countries had their own currency. Now they all use the euro. And yes, they had their ups and downs, but it persists. And it is a major currency. They have their own central bank and they do their own monetary policy. We can do something like that here on the continent. All of this will give us leverage as we trade with the rest of the world. One of the things that Sachs mentioned was that he has put forward to leaders of African countries a model based on China's growth. And he said that if we implement that growth, by 2063, Africa would be an economically wealthy continent. That's not that long away. I don't know about you, but I would love for Africa to be an economically wealthy continent. And again, pointing to China, pointing to India, we've seen it done. It's already happened. They have had their economic revolution and their boost. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just go and see where it's been successful and implement those things here on the continent. And we can talk about how we were colonized and all the issues we had. Well, China had its struggles. They had Mao's China. They had, 10 million people killed under a crazy regime. That's a difficult thing to get over, but they got over it. And India was colonized by the British. Like basically the whole of Africa was colonized. And now, you're seeing India and China, they've got their own space programs. And I'm not saying that Africa needs a space program. What I'm saying is it's a signifier that they are advanced now, that they are a major player on the economic scale when it comes to the global economic order. They are being talked about with the big economic major powers of the world. The chances that all of the individual states within Africa would ever reach a situation where they are one of the economic powers of the world is highly unlikely if we stay divided. But it's almost guaranteed if we can unify. The world's superpowers also have large populations as well as large landmass. That is exactly what Africa has. It's resource rich like nowhere else on earth. Sachs also highlights how there is a lot of what I would call low-hanging fruit to really boost the economy. Talks about education. He talks about railways and roads. He talks about having electricity. And what he's saying is, if we just work on putting together these sectors in a unified way, the growth is almost guaranteed to be rapid. And then as these plans are set in place and the growth begins, the private investment that will be flooding into the continent will be unprecedented. It is what sparks growth. It is not government money that necessarily sparks growth. It's when governments get their act together, then that's when investment just starts flooding in. And that's when the economics start really making sense and blowing up a place. So you've seen rapid growth in China because of this. You've seen rapid growth in India because of this. And I know these places are not perfect. Nowhere is. But this is how they've managed to do it. If the Middle East can do this, places like Dubai, Saudi Arabia, which is like a desert plus oil. If they can do this rapid growth, Africa can do it too. Now, the other factor that Africa has on its side is population and demographics. I talk about this all the time. I made a whole video about this. It is unbelievable the growth in population that is happening right now in the continent of Africa. Sachs explained the numbers. I've seen a range of numbers, but the idea is basically somewhere between 2050 and 2100, Africa's population is going to double, maybe even triple in size. It is basically the only place on Earth where the fertility rate is on a growth trajectory right now as we speak. Now, that may change down in the line, but not after the African population doubles. Everywhere else around the world is declining. And that means that as a percentage, Africa is going to make up something like 40% of the world's population. We need to align our economics with that growth, because we will see disasters if there is double the population of Africa, but Africa still remains poor. You talk about a migrant crisis and our people dying in the sea and leaving the continent. Well, God knows what will happen if we don't unify. You'll probably end up with proper conflict, proper warlords, and all of this madness going on, because people are quick to join negative ideologies when they feel like they have no hope, when they have no agency, when they're abused and they don't see themselves having a bright future. So we have this growing population on the continent. It's time to utilize it, use it to our strength. Africa has all the ingredients to be one of the world's greatest superpowers, if not the number one superpower, which is a very real potential. Sachs even mentions it in the video, so that our standard of living on the continent can be improved. That will all happen. The greater gift is what we will pass to the next generation if we do this right now. One of the interesting things about the pre-colonial era in the continent of Africa is that we didn't have a concept of country, right? We had a concept of tribe. And I think actually de-emphasizing the borders and making Africa more unified can actually pay honor to that tribal identity more than these kind of fake countries that were built by colonial powers. So in that way, I believe it's honoring more who we are, what our culture is, where we come from, what we believed in before colonization and the concept of countries in Africa was established. Most of the time, the differences that happen that lead to, big conflict on the continent of Africa is between two groups that are basically ethnically the same. They share an ancestry, they share a location, they share food and culture. There's just maybe some slight difference, some split somewhere. And these two groups that have so much in common are at war with each other. Why is that? I would rather build wealth with my neighbor, setting aside our differences, than dying on the hill of our differences and all of us dying poor. We get to win some trivial, outdated battle, between this tribe and that tribe and all be poor. Like, what's the point of that? It's totally unnecessary, and it does not promote the future that we want. We get bogged down in these little divisions of religion or division of whatever it is, rather than zooming out, seeing the big picture and saying, there's a big opportunity for all of us to really win if we can just all work together. Everyone talks about ending the conflict in Congo, ending the conflict in Sudan, or wherever the conflict is. This is the solution. We got it right here. Let's create a continent-wide identity. Let's create a continent-wide infrastructure and systems such that we can all benefit from the continent that we're all a part of. The Black community, including the diaspora out there, they have this message that we like to puff ourselves up with and say, we were kings, we were, Egypt and Kush, and this era, this bygone golden era in ancient Africa where we ruled and we had all this great technology and understanding and everything. And we're so quick to point out, oh, Europeans stole this from us and the Europeans stole that from us. Well, this is how we reestablish a golden age. This is how we actualize being kings and being masters of our domain. This is how we honor those ancestors. It's one thing to honor these ancestors by, remembering them and saying we used to be kings or whatever. But I would rather crown my children and grandchildren with economic wealth and abundance and honor my ancestors in that way. We came down this terrible colonial path and we had all these struggles. But look how we've unified. Look how we've got our act together. And now our kids and our grandkids can inherit a world of abundance. Usually I introduce myself at the beginning of the video, but for those of you that don't know, my name is TJ. I'm Nigerian and British mixed, and on this channel, we talk about African geopolitics. If you like the message and you want to see a message like this grow and go far, please hit the subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything, and it allows this channel to grow and therefore spread a message like this even further. I appreciate all of you out there for watching to the end, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.